Kind of give me the outline of your own sort of political journey. Like what kind of radicalized you, your moral development, for lack of a better term. Like how did you kind of arrive at the sort of ideological stance that you obviously have built a really successful brand around today?
Well, when I was younger, like in high school, I was a libertarian in the way I think a lot of young men default to, and a sort
Mhm.
of aversion to authority, translated, very much a "you can't tell me what to do, mom," extrapolated into
Sure.
a broader political position. But I grew more, I guess, economically liberal with time, and then when I went to college, I became a leftist in large part because I had an excellent sociology professor who loaned me some books, some of which were on the Black Panther Party. The assassination of Fred Hampton was one that I was particularly fond of. And, from that point forward, it's mostly been about refining those basic beliefs. I think the fundamental principles I've held have always been consistent. It's
Mhm.
just a matter of how to best achieve them through policy.
Yeah, yeah. So you weren't one of those like I don't know, when I talk to my left-leaning friends, all almost kind of across the board, they all point to 2016 as kind of like a trigger moment for you. You were already kind of well within that thought before the Trump election.
Since 2012, that's probably when I would have started considering myself a leftist, yeah.
Sure, sure, yeah. I mean, so what was your like? Did you always envision having a YouTube channel or being kind of in this line of work? I guess what I'm asking is, did you want to be a YouTuber before you wanted to be a political YouTuber? Like, kind of, how did you get interested in this whole world?
I've always wanted to do this. I got invested in watching other live streamers back in around 2011 when the technology first became even remotely accessible. Mostly because I liked video games. I still do. Watching people play video games at a higher level was just fun to do live. But the idea of doing that myself was always incredibly appealing. It was never really viable, though. I mean, everyone knows that getting successful in this space is like, winning a coin flip 50 times in a row. The odds are just not in your favor. Yeah, I was
Sure.
very surprised when things took off the way they did.
Yeah, yeah. When did you like YouTube took on a very kind of I remember around like kind of around the Trump election that YouTube took on like a more kind of heightened political texture, like that was kind of when I noticed the kind of right-wing stuff popping up more and more on YouTube. Like all of a sudden like I felt like a lot of YouTube creators like kind of had like a political stance, like were like kind of expressing it more openly. Is that something you noticed at all? Did that change the platform in any way? Did that make it more possible to kind of catch fire with a show that's in large parts about politics?
Yeah, well, I think things changed significantly, in my opinion, right around the time of Gamergate, but even that was an
Yeah.
extrapolation of pre-existing trends. Because before then, the big dominant political culture on YouTube were the new atheists, the
Right.
anti-Bible thumper, skeptics who were, epically owning religious fundies with facts and logic and such. But the continuous trend, whenever you see these big political waves on YouTube, is generally speaking, you have very confident and very aggressive white guys who have
Mhm.
channels where they make the opponent look very silly. They try to like bring them on for debates. They usually outperform the opposition. And the problem that I saw is like back in the 2016, 2017, post-Trump election era, you have a very aggressive right wing on YouTube, and the left wing is a bunch of like community theater kids doing book readings.
Right.
You have a bunch of smaller feminist channels that are comparatively very, I don't say this disrespectfully, I enjoyed their work at the time, relatively meek, not, I guess, built for contentious online engagement.
Sure. Yeah.
It's something that we lacked for a pretty long time.
This is kind of like a little bit off track, but I'm just kind of curious. Like, you're totally right about the atheism wave on on early YouTube. It's weird to me, like at least the way I perceive it. A lot of those dudes kind of ended up kind of growing into more right wing presences, or a little bit more like on that side of things. When you kind of associate atheism with maybe a more leftist approach. I don't know. Were you? Do you relate to that at all? Were you all surprised to see that kind of atheist sort of movement morph into the kind of right wing movement that we see on YouTube now?
I was surprised at first, but it made more sense the more I considered it with time, because it feels
Yeah.
like some of the underlying trends were preserved. Oftentimes, people would criticize religiosity for its irrationality, but not for the political prescriptions made by the far-right religious types. So what you
Sure.
have is instead a secularization of the underlying trend of people with some degree of like social power, epically debunking this trend or another. And you'll see a translation of that logic because once Gamergate started, what did they start calling it progressivism? feminism, what have you, but a religion. They reframed
Right.
it. Before, they were epically dunking on the Bible, and now they're epically dunking on the religious precepts of feminism, which include, whatever they wanted to say feminism was that day. But the underlying logic never changed. Only the subject of attack. The goal should be not just to respond to the existence of a bad social force, but to thoroughly critique it and the ways in which it's pernicious. And they never did that. So it made me feel, at least in retrospect, like that was never really the goal. It was just about being better than or feeling smarter than a particular group. Any group would do, really.
Why do you think playing video games has become, because you're not the only one that does this, but it has become like a decent vector for, political conversation, debate, bringing people into, a stream for some pretty heady political talk that wouldn't necessarily tune into otherwise? Like, why do you think video games is a good medium for that?
A few things. First of all, there's a demographic overlap. The people who are loudest about games and online politics both tend to be white men. So there's definitely sort of a proportional bias there. I think a lot of it also works to dispel the perceived seriousness of politics, because it wasn't that long ago that the online politics game was really just some specialized forums, people who, I mean, really, if you go back 10 or 15 years, oftentimes online politics was constrained almost entirely to like policy specific, like real politics circles, like groups of people who actually have a political or business interest in the outcomes of some elections or policies. Nowadays, it's like we're off to the gladiatorial arenas. People are taking bets on who's going to be killed out there. It's a whole bread and circus deal now, and the fact that it's been, I suppose you could call that democratized, means that I think you're going to see it appeal more and more and overlap with more and more the kinds of media that people consume broadly as well. It's a sort of intentional demystification. How serious can politics really be if you can ramble about it while playing Minecraft, right?
I remember tuning into Hassan's stream on the night of the Ukraine invasion, and the headline was just like, Russia invades Ukraine. The next line was like, Elden Ring later. And I just thought that to me is the epitome of, of our political moment in a lot of ways. Speaking of that, I wrote a story about Hassan last year, and I posed the same question to you. We can leave on this. I'm just curious for you, you're how do you kind of square, how do you kind of meld, like, I'm making a lot of money off this. This is a great job for me. I've become famous. I'm a famous YouTuber, which is, like, as you mentioned at the top, it's something that you've thought I wanted for a long time, while also, wanting to do a social good, while wanting to feel that, like, I'm living by my ethics, with my ethics. This is not some like right-wing gotcha, like, oh, you're making money while, claiming to be a socialist. I promise you, I'm not asking that question in that degree. But I'm just kind of curious for you, like how do you kind of feel at peace with, your success, living by your ethics, living by your creed, and thinking that all those things are aligned and moving in the same direction?
Well, I got in hot water a few times for this with the Hassan thing. I don't really mind that much, people being wealthy socialists, At the end of the day, in a capitalist society, political power and influence correlate pretty much directly to wealth. And as a product of that, given the fact that we want prominent and powerful socialists, I mean, we kind of have to, there's no way around that. You need those to win. It is inevitable that there's going to be within those circles a disproportionate accumulation of wealth. Now, I do think it's quite nice when people are generous with their money, and I mean, I try. I donate quite a bit to charity. I raise quite a bit to charity. I pay my editors, frankly, too much, but that's they shanghaied me with their contracts. What am I but the victim there? But in terms of the, like, feeling comfortable with what you are and what you do, I just think it's important to remember that this is always going to be the struggle of people who are fighting for a better world than the one they live in. Whether you're an egalitarian today or hundreds of years ago, whether you're, a person conscious of animal rights who isn't necessarily a vegan, or hell, if you are a vegan but still participate in any number of other industries that rely on animal exploitation, whether you're an anti-colonialist but you still pay your taxes to the US government, and Lord only knows where that goes. If people are looking to feel guilty, they will find sources of guilt. But I'm not looking to feel guilty, and I'm never guilty. I do what I can with what I have, and I also live a comfortable life because I want to. If we adhere to higher standards of self-flagellation if we are constantly scrutinizing, constantly self-checking, second-guessing? Am I being generous enough? Am I this or that? What we're inevitably doing is establishing a social standard where it is more difficult for people to become powerful socialists because they're subjected to higher degrees of scrutiny, higher degrees of self-imposed guilt. And while I do think there's a place for conversations like these, should socialists be showing off, $200,000 Porsches and doing like, meme-tages about them getting in it and like spilling soda everywhere on purpose? So they're like, oops, then they buy a second $200,000 Porsche because it's,
Right.
yeah, like, can we have a conversation about those things? Absolutely. But I don't think guilt has to play any part in that at all. I just think that's an unhealthy, reflexive response.